So we practice here at Breakspear environmental medicine, and this is where we are looking for the impact of the environment on people, and we're also looking at the way in which the body works to deal with all of these things. So for example, we will have to look at people's metabolic function, which means their ability to break down things, and we look at the way in which people can clear toxins which they accumulate. There's nobody on earth now who is not exposed to pollutants, and they're man-made pollutants mainly. And the pollutants have, except for one group actually, and these are people called the Wawaroni Indians who live in South America, and they are people who are cannibalistic, and so it's rather difficult to get to them to find out anything about them. But they did manage, somebody spent 6 months encouraging them to accept him, and they did, and he then persuaded them to let him have some samples from them, which he brought back, and they didn't have any pollutants in them that were measured by a laboratory called Accuchem Laboratory, which was measuring pesticides and other pollutants. So they were the only group in the world that have been found not to have pollutants in them, because they live under the canopy of the Amazon, and they're shielded. So again, why choose a urine sample? Well, the other samples that one can get from the body are saliva samples, but saliva will vary, because if you think about a lemon, it becomes thin. If you are sleeping with your mouth open all night and you do a saliva sample in the morning, it's thick and dense. And there's no point in doing saliva samples because they give inaccurate results. They can only give a yes or no over things. They can't give you an accurate report. So we can use urine though, because we have a marker in it with which we can have a comparator, and this is a particular protein component in it, creatinine, which we can measure, and we can then say it's per units of creatinine. So even if the urine might be weaker because you've drunk a lot, or more concentrated, it doesn't matter, because you're working it out in proportion to the amount of this component in it, and therefore it's standardized. So here we've got a standardized means of measuring things and being able to tell a good deal about a person's status. So one of the tests we're going to be talking about is called urinary organic acids. And this is a urine sample that's collected first thing in the morning so that it's as concentrated as we can get it. But the urinary organic acids test will tell us 76 different features. And this is quite a vast array of information about a person's metabolism. And it also, in the urine, there are components which come from the gut, because not everything that is in the urine is human. Some of it is from bacteria or yeasts that we might be harbouring in the gut, and so they produce products which get absorbed into the body and come out into the urine. And we can therefore tell a lot more about the gut flora, we call it. And we know that this is involved in a large number of illnesses. We need to know about the gut flora. There are trillions of different organisms that live in the gut. So doing a fecal sample will tell you a little snapshot about a few of the items, but it doesn't tell you about the way in which those organisms' metabolism has affected the human. Whereas with a urine sample, what's gone into the body will be utilized, and provided you know what you're looking for in the urine, you can do a huge amount to ascertain what's in the gut, what's being metabolized in the body, and indeed also from the diet. So this test will tell us about a large number of vitamins and whether we've got adequate resources of them. It'll tell us about amino acids and fats, and amino acids from proteins, fats. It'll tell us about dietary resources as well. So it's an extremely valuable test. So there are it's quite a lot of things that are tested. Yeast and fungal markers from yeasts from the gut, bacterial markers, Clostridia. People might know about Clostridia difficile. This is an organism that is known by the public as being toxic, and it can cause severe diarrhea, and it's one of the difficult bugs, the hospital-acquired infections, they say, Clostridia difficile. But that's not true, because we all harbour it. Whether it overgrows or whether there's too much of it is to ascertain from a urine sample. We can know about oxalate metabolites, and this glycolytic, this means how the sugars are broken down. And mitochondria, these are the little energy packets inside cells which produce energy in a cycle that is known medically as the Krebs cycle. And the mitochondria also produce products from protein breakdown. But we can also measure what's going on in the brain. We can measure neurotransmitter metabolites. And these others, pyrimidine, ketone, nutritional markers, indicators of detoxification, amino acid metabolites, mineral metabolism, and fluid intake. We can tell all these different components from a urine test. And it's far more than can be ascertained ordinarily from a standard test that's done in the doctor's laboratory, where they can take a sample and they do a dipstick and say, is there sugar in this? It's a little bit more in depth than that. So the first tests that were done are ones for yeast and fungal products, and this is the list. Citramalic acid, 5-hydroxymethyl-2-furoic acid, 3-oxyglutaric acid. These are all chemical names, and I'm not going to tell you all of their functions at the moment, but I will pick out from this what we would look at for people. Furan 2,5-dicarboxylic acid, furan dicarbonyl, glycine as well, and furan carbonyl glycine, tartaric acid, arabinose, carboxy citric acid, and tricarboxylic acids. There are a lot of different things that are produced from yeasts which come into the urine. And from bacteria, there are all these, hippuric acid, and these others. I won't mention the whole lot at the moment, because I'm coming to individual things which are of importance shortly. And these are from that Clostridia difficile, some of them. This one, 4-cresol. If we find a lot of that, we give people antibiotics to knock down the amount of 4-cresol. But a lot of these are products from bacteria. And oxalates, these are products which are made from foods. A lot of foods contain oxalates, but they can settle in the liver and cause stones. And so it's important for us to know about these. And these are from breaking down of carbohydrates, lactic acid and pyruvic acid. And these are from, as I said, the Krebs cycle, which is one of the principal energy cycles in the body. So this is a little bit small, I don't know how legible it is, but this is the Krebs cycle, and it shows all these products, citric acid and isocitrate and so on, all the way down round. And when we metabolize things, they go round this circle, and as they go, so comes out energy. Energy over there, and energy here. So this has to be working efficiently. This cycle is aerobic. It requires oxygen for it to work. If a person hasn't got enough oxygen in their tissues, it doesn't work efficiently. So we measure oxygen separately, but it'll give us an idea, if this isn't working, that their oxygen metabolism is inadequate, and that they may need oxygen supplies. So the top one here is glucose and so on, contributing to this, and that's where it comes into this cycle. But you could see, if I say this particular one is the beginning of the cycle, if this is high, there must be a blockage just after it. If this one, succinate, is high, then there's a blockage here. Now what we know is, when we measure these in the urine, that if we find some of these out of order, we can then know which things to give a person to put it right, because they might need coenzyme Q10, for example, or vitamin B2, for that to go to that. And we know which components are needed to rectify this cycle and to put it right. So this is a complicated one, but a simpler one is just to say that food here is either proteins or carbohydrates or fats, and they come down here. The carbohydrates bypass the Krebs cycle, and they're broken down without oxygen. So we know if there are a lot of products from carbohydrates, there's been not enough oxygen supplied. If they come into this cycle, the citric acid cycle, then we know that fats are being used. Now why? Because carbohydrates convert into fats and they come down here into this cycle. Now why do fats get into this cycle particularly? Why is it important? It's because we are animals. Plants use carbohydrates a lot for their metabolism, so they would use that. But animals, because they have to be able to store food and run about, they go from one place to another, they store the carbohydrates as fats, and then when they need energy, they break down the fats. So in fact, plants don't have huge quantities of fats except in maybe in their seeds or such places. So these ones are from amino acids, excuse me, and these are from neurotransmitters. Well, the brain transmits information from one neuron to another using transmitters, and we can measure all of these, so we know a huge amount about how the brain is working from this urine test. So if we're measuring these things, we know quite a lot. I mentioned this in particular, kynurenic acid, and I'm going to say this is partly why we find this test so useful, because if that is high, we know the person is short of vitamin B6. If this one is high, we know the person is short of vitamin B3. Excuse me. So we are able to calculate what we need to do to rectify people. And this one is to do with folate metabolism. And if these are abnormal, then we know that we can't make some of the building blocks that we need for new cells, which are called methyl groups, one carbon and 3 hydrogen atoms makes up what's called a methyl group, and we need to have these for a new cell. All organic matter, all creatures will have carbon as part of their metabolism. So a small group, CH3, is the useful thing that we need as a methyl group. But this tells us about how the fats are being broken down, and we can work out from that quite a lot about fats. With nutritional markers, some of the urine products tell us if a person is short of various vitamins. B12, if this level is very high, the person is short of B12, and if this one is very, very high, it hasn't been broken down, and the person is short of vitamin B2. So we can rectify a lot of things, and this is all indicators for detoxification. If this one here is very high, the person is short of a very important component that's needed for breaking down chemicals and clearing away things from the body, a detox chemical called glutathione. But we can find out too if somebody's been consuming a lot of aspartame or salicylates, aspirins, or sometimes the bacteria make this. And if the liver is not working well, we'll find ammonia excess. So we can find out a huge amount of things from these, and these are all different amino acid metabolites. And with regard to minerals, we look at phosphoric acid and creatinine, and I said that creatinine is used as a marker, a comparator, so we can compare one sample with another, and we've therefore got standardization. So yeast metabolites and bacterial metabolites are tested from a urine sample. Now everybody tends to think Candida, which is a yeast, can be a bit of a problem for people. It gives people oral thrush, it can give people gastrointestinal problems. Babies have thrush sometimes because ladies can have vaginal thrush. So it's really quite important to know about this. And we can measure active yeast infections from a urine test. And this is a definitive test. If you look at the stool, which is another way of checking for yeasts, they may find some, but mostly they're killed off by bacteria. So there's no quantitative evaluation from a stool test. So all these tests are done, as I say, and I'm going to talk about the yeast and fungal markers. This one, called citramalic acid, is from Saccharomyces or Propion bacteria, and Saccharomyces is yeast. So if somebody has too much yeasts in their gut, they will have an elevation of that. This one, furans, many of them are the byproducts of an organism called Aspergillus. Now, Aspergillus is a yeast as well, but people don't know that when you buy your bread from a supermarket where it's been manufactured in bulk, very often they don't use yeast as the leavener in the major baking houses. They do in the small bakeries. They use ordinary yeast, which will be Saccharomyces species, but they use Aspergillus type of things in major supermarket breads. They might use some yeast, but they have a sort of dough mixture, and then they add this as a leavening, and it will be Aspergillus. So this tells us whether or not people can have got too much of a problem from it. Also, this one, 3-oxoglutaric acid, is part of that Krebs cycle that we were talking about. well, it can get involved in that Krebs cycle. What's in the Krebs cycle itself is 2-oxoglutaric acid, but it's so alike this. It's as similar, though, metabolically, as a moth is to a butterfly, shall we say. What we really want is 2-oxoglutaric acid, the butterfly. We don't want the moth in the way. So, in fact, it's a metabolic mimic, and if we find it, we then need to know how to get rid of it, and we've got to do something about interfering with our energy. And tartaric acid, this is neurological toxin, and it's why a lot of people have to decant wines, because it can accumulate, and they have to separate off some of the wines. Arabinose is also present in this urine sample. If it's very high, then we know we need to treat the person for their problems. They've got an overgrowth of yeast. Arabinose is not a very good product because it sticks proteins together, and it stops them from behaving normally. So proteins make up enzymes, they make up the protein structures in the body, they make up antibodies, and what we find here is that arabinose will interfere with those. It sticks these proteins together so they're hobbled, they can't work. So what we want to do is to, if we find a lot of arabinose, then we treat for a yeast infection. And we tend to use very simple products to treat yeast infections. We like nystatin, which is a prescription drug, but it's not absorbed, so it acts only locally in the gut, and it will get rid of the excess yeast quite well. So carboxy citric acid is a mimic, a metabolic mimic, another moth of citric acid in the Krebs cycle. And this one, tricarbalic acid, comes from the fungal toxins which are often on the outsides of corn, and those make a sort of black residue on corn, but sometimes they are all sort of squished up together and put into your corn products, whereas they are quite toxic. So then we look at the next one here, bacterial markers, and I'll go through this a little bit more quickly because there's a lot, there's 76 different items that one can identify. But hippuric acid, this is derived from benzoate, which is made in the gut by bacteria. And the benzoate goes to the liver, where we add glycine onto it, which is one of the amino acids, and that turns it into hippuric acid. But it can be very often elevated because of bacterial overgrowth inside the gastrointestinal tract. And this is very important because it depends where it's coming from. The small intestine is supposed to be sterile. When we swallow food, it may not be sterile at all, and the stomach sterilizes it. The acid there is quite strong, and it can sterilize it. In a dog, the acid is so strong that it'll even break up bones. It just sort of, but our acid should be strong enough to sterilize food. So what we know is that if there's a lot of benzoate there, it could be in the small intestine, and we then need to do something about it because people will have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is not very nice for them. It gives them a lot of products of metabolism which are unhelpful. So hippuric acid we measure, as I say, and I beg your pardon, sometimes they use benzoate as a preservative in foods as well. So again, this is produced, these two are produced from bacteria, and they tell us about different types of bacteria that will be present. The ones for Clostridia, I mentioned that Clostridia, it's an anaerobic bacterium. Some strains are not very helpful for us, and so we can measure small intestinal bacterial overgrowth when this level is high. And C. difficile can produce this particular product. There are about 100 different species of Clostridia, but it's not specific for C. difficile, but C. difficile is one which is thought to be hospital acquired. It isn't actually, but overgrowth of it can be life-threatening in people who are in surgical wards, for example. And here, this is the specific marker for C. difficile. So then we look at oxalate metabolites, and they are these two substances, glyceric acid and glycolic acid. And I just say that the whole of this test is extremely useful because you can tell something like several hundred different genetic disorders from it as well. The first use of an organic acids test is to ascertain genetic markers for people with quite severe genetic diseases, and it was originally used by Dr. Shaw at the Kansas Mercy Children's Hospital, where there were 600 beds for children, and he was finding all these things and wondering where they were all coming from. And you can find out all kinds of genetic markers to identify for these children. But in addition, these are quite useful because of yeast overgrowth. And oxalic acid, you can get high levels in quite a lot of conditions like sarcoid or celiac disease, bacterial overgrowth, cirrhosis and diabetes, and people who have had small bowel disease. So there are markers. It gives us indications as to what to do and how to investigate people further, patients further. These are glycolytic cycle metabolites, which we measure also. And they are the lactic and pyruvic acid. I told you it was the bypass one for carbohydrate. And you can get elevated people who've been doing a lot of vigorous exercise, or sometimes it'll be high because of infection. At other times it's high because they've got vitamin B deficiency, or they haven't got enough oxygen and poor perfusion. So we can actually tell a huge amount about a person's metabolic function. And then I mentioned the Krebs cycle. And this one, succinic acid, is due to a deficiency of CoQ10. This one is a defect in various mitochondrial functions. And this is B3 and CoQ10. So from this, we can actually tell which vitamins a person will require, whether they require B12, folinic acid, B2, B3, B6, a huge number of deficit. Now, if you did a blood sample for those, there might be very small quantities there, and you wouldn't be able to tell whether that was adequate for the person. But this is a functional test because it's told us that there isn't enough for that person's needs if we find abnormalities. So this is for amino acid metabolites, and I said that they can use this for ascertaining genetic diseases, but also for mitochondrial disorders. And those are where the energy is produced in the mitochondria. So then neurotransmitter metabolites. Now, I don't think this is clearly legible, sorry about this, but tryptophan is a substance which is broken down either into quinolinic acid, which is toxic, or serotonin, which is the feel-good neurotransmitter. And from this test we can find out if it's going the wrong way and rectify it. So I think that that's a very useful test. So here we test folate metabolism. Now folic acid is very important in making these methyl groups I was telling you about. And if you get an elevated level here, you've got a defect in folic acid metabolism. And high values of thiamine are associated with inflammation. So you can actually pinpoint where the problem is in a person from this urine test. Ketone and fatty acid oxidation, we can get all of these elevated in a fasting sample, but I've told you that we do have fasting samples. We take the first morning sample, but we're able to make a judgment as to whether these are of importance in our patients. Nutritional markers, we can get B12, this stuff called methylmalonic acid. It's a marker for B12 deficiency, and B12 is very enlivening for a lot of people with chronic fatigue syndrome and chronic tiredness. Now, people don't like the term chronic fatigue syndrome. They prefer ME or post-exertional malaise syndrome. There are all these different terms for it. But it comes to the bottom line is that that person is suffering from fatigue. And we know that if we can give them B12, very often we can help them. So there are a number of ways in which we evaluate this. Clinically, we find that there's vibration sensation lost in the legs. In the urine sample, it's a high level of methylmalonic acid. If you just did a blood test, sometimes you can get a very big cells, they're called macrocytes, big red cells, because the bone marrow doesn't let the red cells out into the circulation until they've gathered up all the B12 they can possibly get, because it's so invaluable for the red cell function. So the problem, but we can do it much more simply from a urine sample. And we can say whether the B6 is elevated or deficient, and B5. This one is essential for the start of the Krebs cycle. And this one we can measure. Vitamin C comes, we can measure that, vitamin CoQ10. Glutathione precursor is called N-acetylcysteine. Now, glutathione is one of the major detoxifying substances that we must have, and we make it in the body. There are a huge number of functions of it. One of the principal ones is that it clears away major pollutants from the body, both the ones we make ourselves in the course of a day's activities and those which come from pollutants that we are accumulating. And also this biotin, if this is elevated, there's a biotin deficiency. So it's recently been found that biotin can make myelin, can help to make myelin, which is needed for the myelin sheaths around cells, and people with multiple sclerosis don't have a proper myelin sheath. So there's been a big trial done by various neurologists, but it's the information is on the MS newsletters and so on, showing that biotin has been useful in reversing multiple sclerosis plaques. So together with essential fats, which are necessary for these sheaths, and biotin, you can improve neurological function. Now, a lot of people think MS is a special thing, but it isn't, because it overlaps with neurodegenerative diseases to some extent, and biotin is necessary for anyone who has a neurological inflammatory disease, which includes ME, chronic fatigue, and post-exertional malaise. So I'm just going on to indicators for detoxification, and this is the glutathione. If we find a low level of this, there is glutathione deficiency, and we can supply it. And this makes an enormous difference. Supplying glutathione 2 or 3 times a day for people who are fatigued very often reverses their problems. So ammonia excess is associated with viral liver infection very often, or liver disease. So we're able to tell about liver function from that. And also we have to be aware that people are taking all sorts of things and swallowing this aspartame stuff, which is a neurotoxin to many people. And we can show that elevated levels of this are telling us that our patients are eating too much of that stuff. So this is amino acid metabolites, and we can find deficiencies of vitamin B1, which is thiamine, or lipoic acid, which is the precursor of glutathione. So these will give us that information. And this is a genetic disease marker, and this another genetic disease marker. Again here, genetic disease marker, and this one is phenylketonuria, and they always have to look for that in genetic diseases as they do here. So the genetic disease identification is done from a urine organic acid test at Great Ormond Street. Again, genetic disorders. So it's not a peculiar test that's out with the health service. They use it, but in a very limited way. Mineral metabolism, phosphoric acid, this can be relating to dietary intake, but vitamin D deficiency will result in abnormal levels of this. So we can tell about that. So I think that overall the information about urine organic acids is invaluable to a clinician, and it's such a simple collection. It's just a urine sample first thing in the morning, so it can be used to tell us about practically every common vitamin, a lot of metabolic disorders, and we find it extremely helpful.